Thank you. So welcome. I'm glad to be here from Mesa, Arizona. These are some shots of our high flex classes from this semester. One of the things that I think sets Mesa Adult Education apart from a lot of the other programs that I've heard are doing high flex is that we are all in. All of our classes are high flex as of this past August, and that includes our beginner English classes all the way up to our advanced HSC prep classes. So it's given us kind of the big picture of some of the strategies we need to use as a program, as well as individual instructors, as to how to implement this so that we're engaging our students as much as possible. So let me talking a little bit about our journey over the last, it's been about a year and a half, but actually doing high flex in our classrooms, it's been since August. I wanted to reiterate three things that I think are essential, and my answer to the question that David was asked earlier, whether you would still do it if your tech is limited. And I would still say yes, but with a huge caveat that tech is super important. We are in the process of upgrading our classroom tech now, and it has caused a lot of headaches. So if you're thinking about moving to high flex, either on an individual course basis or across your whole program, you've got to have the mindset for tech, the budget for tech, and then the ability to keep playing and tinkering to make it work for your students, because it is a really steep learning curve for a lot of students and teachers. And if you don't have that, high flex is not going to work. The other thing you need are fearless teachers, and we've got a whole set of them. These are the teachers that have been doing high flex with us. So you can kind of get a sense of the size of our program. We have about 20 classes. The other piece that's essential is not just the fearlessness, but the idea that they're designing a course. They're not just providing or delivering instruction or facilitating learning. It's a much bigger design thinking mindset. And then the other piece, especially when you're implementing high flex across multiple classes or the whole program, is that those people that aren't in the classrooms, that don't have those direct touch points with students, all understand what you're doing, and that they're supporting it, because there are a lot of ups and downs that happen on whenever you're implementing a huge change like this. So everybody from the person who's answering the phones for inquiring students, to the testing people, to the career and college transition people, that they all understand what you're doing and that you're supporting the learning. So I'm going to start back with a little bit of a story of how we got to high flex that will probably be familiar to a lot of you. So before March 2020, we were only an in-person program. We had no institutional experience teaching online. And for us, at the most basic level, engagement meant our students showing up in class. That was how we determined at the lowest level what engagement was. Of course, you would see what their learning process was and their learning products at the end of class, their verbal and nonverbal engagement in the classroom, to kind of help facilitate that. And then the pandemic hit, and we went immediately to emergency remote teaching, like many of you did. For us, it lasted a little bit longer than a year. And now engagement meant online class and homework in a much bigger way than they ever did before the pandemic. And this will probably look really familiar to any of you. It's what we were seeing right now since my camera's not on. But it made it really hard to figure out what engagement was. Students could be logging into your class, but you never really knew if they were engaged or not. And I kind of started thinking of this as our Schrodinger students, that students were kind of in a box for the last year, and they were simultaneously engaged and disengaged in their learning. And it was really hard to know which, so you had to operate on the idea that they are both simultaneously until you find a way to unbox them and figure out, are they actually doing the homework, but they just don't know how to turn it in so that the teacher doesn't know what they're doing? Or are they really not even trying the homework? Or do they not have the tech tools at home to even start it? And the same when they were in the class. Is their camera off and they're not using chat because they don't know how to turn them on? Or are they really just showing up and watching the class like it's a YouTube channel? It was a really hard stage, and I think pretty much everyone on this webinar has been through this. So when we started thinking about what are we going to be doing after the emergency remote teaching, that engagement was a really big question, because we had two very different experiences in how students are engaging in their learning, and we had some time to think about what we wanted to do next. And HighFlex, when we started to research it and read about it and hear about other programs that were doing it on a big or small scale, it seemed like a really good opportunity to unbox what our students were doing when we couldn't physically see them in the classroom. Jen talked earlier about the 4 values of HighFlex, and these were things that we were all concerned about. Accessibility for the students and the teachers in terms of technology, giving our students more choice, not less choice after we came out of the emergency remote teaching. From the teacher standpoint and the student standpoint, making sure that all of our learning objects, class routines, and activities worked in various modes. And then at the end of the day, all of our students were learning or reaching the same learning outcomes, whether that was passing GED tests or becoming successful users of English. And all of those things were values that we had, but were also challenges, and we weren't really sure that we were getting there. So HighFlex was the way we decided to go. And the first thought almost everybody had was on one part of the instructional piece, the class time. How are we going to teach students who are both in the classroom and online at the same time? But that's just one piece of the instructional transition to HighFlex that needs to happen in a program or in a course. There's also a lot of structural things that we put into place program-wide and within the class to make sure that the instruction was going well. And as we started to work on it further, we also realized that it's also a cultural shift from where we were pre-pandemic. So all of these different changes happen at the same time. And even though the focus is always on how do you teach concurrent students when they're in the room at home, that's just one aspect of HighFlex. The first big cultural transition we made is we started talking to students about their goals. And one of their goals is to study 8 hours a week. So it went from pre-pandemic, the message was show up for class. And now the message is find 8 hours in your schedule every week to devote to your learning, engaging in your learning. And that was actually a big cultural shift, and it's working pretty well. I wouldn't say we're there yet, but it's working pretty well. The next thing was to find different ways for the students to get to those 8 hours every week. And when we're talking to the students, this is one of the slides we use in our orientation, is classwork, homework, and lab work. And so there's 3 ways that students can engage in their learning in our HighFlex system. If we're going to unpack that a little bit further, classwork for us is the synchronous instruction when we have students online and in person. And it's roughly 6 hours a week, an opportunity for 6 hours a week for most of our students. The asynchronous learning piece comes in as homework. And the homework is both homework that's aligned to the class and supporting the learning in the class, but it's also self-study, self-paced work that students can do on their own. And then that third piece is the lab work. It's not a class, but it's support. It's synchronous support, primarily in person, but we're trying to expand it so that it reaches the online students as well. One of the other structural changes we did was we transitioned from, in our emergency remote teaching, telling teachers whatever platform works for you and your students, use it, to saying these are the platforms that our district supports and that we can support in training and in tech issues. So we severely limited the options. No more Zoom for our classes, we're all WebEx now. And on the other side of things, we increased the different content platforms we were using in our classes and for homework. So at the same time we were limiting the platforms like Canvas and WebEx, we were expanding the different places we were getting content. And we do all of this as we're onboarding new students. So during the orientation weeks, students are doing homework online. They have an orientation class they need to attend, either in person or online. And they also need to come to their class for their scheduled testing time. And we also offer tech workshops to make sure that they're ready for class. And those are all through the lab. So right from the beginning, students are getting the idea that learning is a more comprehensive system. It's not just your class. You're not just showing up for class anymore, but you're spending 8 hours a week, every week on it. And we help them with the study plan so they can find out, start thinking about and scheduling where in their lives these 8 hours are going to fit. We're going to talk a little bit more about instruction and how that has changed for us. So teachers, one of the big shifts for teachers is, like I said earlier, they're not just thinking about my job is to lesson plan and to deliver or facilitate learning during class time. It's much more comprehensive than that. They're now really designing a course, and that's a big shift for some of our teachers. And that includes thinking about how these three different components integrate in for the students at their level or their subject: the classwork, the homework, and the lab work. And we're using Canvas as our glue to put it all in one place because there's multiple links and various things that are going on. Canvas was a new system for us. We didn't use an LMS across the board before this term. So that was another big shift that teachers had to learn: how to use the Canvas platform and then how to make it accessible for their users. And this is one of our more robust Canvas courses, but this is what it looks like for a weekly module for the students. Those blue parts are the agendas for class time. The students have access to those red parts, which are the homework that's tied to the class, and also the extra work if students want to improve their vocabulary or their listening skills. And then down there at the bottom, you've got that yellow one to remind them of the lab, the opportunities, when they should go, and if there's any special workshops going on. So like I said, this is a more robust one, but this is something that one of our teachers created for her students for their weekly 8 hours of learning. Inside the class, we're keeping our class time to 3 hours, but we've given teachers a cushion of 30 minutes for an opening and 30 minutes for a closing. And most teachers are doing some kind of do now routine at opening and some kind of wrap up at the end. The instruction in the middle is where we're focusing our attention moving forward, but it's been interesting. In the past, we've done a combination of direct instruction, station rotation, and inquiry-based instruction. And what we found when we shifted across the board to HighFlex is that teachers tended to focus on direct instruction activities, probably from some of what they've said and some of what we've observed, is that there's a sense of loss of control when you first switch to HighFlex because students are in so many places and you may not have control of your tech yet. And direct instruction allows the instructor to have a little more control. Now that we're nearing the end of our second term doing HighFlex, we're seeing a lot more teachers using breakout rooms and station rotation, and we're starting to see mini project-based learning activities happening. So I think this transition will start happening more and more. Another thing is that teachers are starting to think more intentionally about their homework. It's no longer just what we didn't get done during class time, but it's intentional of how to either prepare them for the next lesson or give them extra reinforcement from what they did in the lesson. And then also thinking about what kind of self-study opportunities would be good for their students, for those that have specific learning needs or extra time, and how to get them to use the platforms and how to report back to us that they're doing them. And then the same with lab work. We're finding that a lot of teachers are starting to think intentionally about how to encourage their students to use the lab. We're starting to see a few study groups forming. A lot of our students are using them mostly for extra help right now, but as we start to roll out more workshop opportunities in the spring semester, things like workforce skills and study skills and some guest speakers, we're hoping that teachers will have more tools to help fill out that lab work piece. So like I said, we're at our end of our second term of doing HighFlex, but we really only have complete data for the first term, that very first term that was kind of messy when we were learning new tech, learning new Canvas, and meeting new students. So I wanted to share with you some of our preliminary results. When we look back at thinking about getting students to study 8 hours every week, our term was 8 weeks, so our golden number was 64 hours of learning. And again, at the most basic level, that's purely attendance. Where are students spending their time? And this chart shows every individual one of our students and where they got their time from. So you can see for most of our students, that blue section classwork is where they were engaging the most, which makes sense. Most students have up to 6 hours a week to actually attend class. But you'll notice the red pieces, those are where students were spending homework time. And there are a few students that were learning more asynchronously than they were in the synchronous class time. And this is partially because of levels, because we've expanded options, because some students have learned how to learn asynchronously during the pandemic in ways that they may not have done before. And that's kind of an exciting thing that we haven't really tracked much before. And so it's really interesting to see how students are engaging with that asynchronous piece. And then the little yellow pieces below, you can see the students that showed up for the lab, and some of them came multiple times and some were only one shots. But that kind of gives a brief snapshot of how our students are using their 8 hours. We had some questions as a program about how these different components were going to be selected. Now that we're giving students more choices, what choices would they actually make? And our first one was, if we're allowing students to show up in person or online for class, what would they do? This is a class breakdown, but on an individual student breakdown, we found that most of our attendance hours are coming in person, but that very few of our students are doing exclusively all in person or exclusively all online. That there's times when students who are mostly in person will opt to come online, sometimes because of COVID quarantine, sometimes because their car broke down. And then there are other students who prefer to learn online, but when they are hitting a glitch or they're unsure of something, they will make their way into the in-person classroom so they can meet their classmates and talk more closely with their teacher. So students are taking advantage of the option to switch back and forth, even though most students have a dominant preference. The other question was, now that we're adding this asynchronous homework piece, are students going to actually do it? Because that's something that we haven't always tracked in our classes, and we haven't always made a really intentional push to get students to do significant amounts of homework. And we're finding that most of them are. Of course, there's always a few students that do zero homework, but we also have students that are averaging 3 to 4 hours of asynchronous homework every week. And as we start to get better with finding which platforms work for our students, I think that those numbers will increase for some of them. We were also curious as to how students were going to choose the synchronous versus the asynchronous time. How would they choose to come to class and do homework? And we found that most of the students are spending about 10 to 25% of their total study time every week doing asynchronous homework. And this is probably up quite a bit from where we were pre-pandemic. And it'll be interesting to see how this changes again as we get better at teaching the concurrent classes and we get better at offering asynchronous homework. And then our last question was, who is actually using the lab? And we found that in that very first term, when things were brand new for basically everyone, about 20% of our students were attending the lab. And it was a pretty even spread over the different levels of our ESL classes and our adult basic and secondary ed classes. Some of the students were repeat customers, that this was part of their study time and they would use it as a study hall. And then we had quite a few that would only come in when they had questions or problems or wanted extra help. So as we look back at our progress from that first term one and those 4 values that HighFlex was promising us would help us engage our students more, engage them in different ways, and engage them more deeply. We look at the accessibility, the learner choice, the reusability, and the equivalency. And in our first 8 weeks, we were definitely showing a lot of promise, even from early on. I wouldn't say we were necessarily effective in any of these areas 8 weeks in, but in accessibility, we did a much better job reaching students and teachers, both with devices and with supporting the skills that they needed to learn them both in and out of the classroom with workshops and with teacher help. Learner choice, their students are making hopefully better choices, but they're definitely making different choices and they're taking advantage of the new options that they have that they didn't necessarily have either during emergency remote teaching or previously when we were only a face-to-face program. Teachers are getting better and more familiar with the various routines, classroom routines, activities, and platforms, and we're identifying which ones are reusable and which ones cross over between the in-person and online, and also synchronous and asynchronous options. The equivalency one, it's still a little too soon to tell how we're doing. It's going to take us a while before we get to really see how the students are studying, how they're engaging with these different options, and then how they're doing on the outcome. So we may not really have a good idea of how we're doing in that area until the end of next semester. But anecdotally, it looks promising. And I've noticed a huge jump in the classroom just from term 1 to term 2. And we're rounding out term 2 next week. So we're really excited about all the opportunities, even though it has been a struggle. It's been a lot of work for everyone. So that kind of gives you our very big picture and very lightning round overview of what we've been doing for the last 4 or 5 months. Hopefully it gives us a lot to think about, and thank you very much.